Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by TechStrong and HackerOne. My name is Cody J. Brown, and I'm the host of TechStrong Learning. We have an exciting presentation, but before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping notes. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of the event or you'd like to share it with a friend, the on-demand will be available after the webinar concludes. If you look on the right side of your screen, you'll find a couple tabs. The first one being Q&A. This is where we want you to send in any questions you might have throughout today's webinar. Our topic today is going to be more of a conversational flow, so our speakers might address your questions as we move through today's presentation. So be sure to send them in as you think of them. I'll also point you to our chat tab, and this is where we want you to just engage with one another, tell us where you're tuning in from, so on and so forth. If you look at the handouts tab on the right side of your screen, you'll see 4 resources that have been made available to you to help enhance today's webinar. And finally, at the end of today's webinar, we will have a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So on to our topic at hand. Today, we're talking about DevSecOps, closing the security gap with developers. And I'm joined today by Alex Rice, co-founder and CTO at HackerOne, and Greg Oza, Senior Director of Product Security Engineering at GitHub. And it's my pleasure at this point in time to turn the floor over to Alex to kick us off. Thank you both for being with us today.
Great. Thanks so much, Cody, and welcome, everybody. So I'm Alex Rice. I'll be having a conversation here with Greg today as we dive into a handful of topics around developers and operations and security working together. But I thought we should introduce ourselves first and get to help you all get to know us a bit before we dive right into the meat of the subject. Greg is leading product security over at GitHub, but he's seen a lot throughout his career. He's been a kernel device driver developer, a pen tester, an engineering teacher. Most recently has been seeing GitHub through its product security journey. Greg, I don't want to leave anything important out. I'd love if you could do a little bit of introduce yourself for us.
Sure. Thanks, Alex. And thanks for chatting with me today. I'm super excited about our conversation. So as you mentioned, I've seen a lot of different things across security, mostly focused on application security. You mentioned kernel device driver. I was like, oh, that feels like a lifetime ago, focusing on that or working on that. But, in the last, I want to say, I think I've been at GitHub now for 8.5, going on 9 years this year, joined GitHub to focus on application security and start building out the application security practice there. So as you imagine, over the past 9 years, we've seen a ton of different growth. I've seen my own role and responsibility change, and just really what GitHub as a company and what our engineers need from security change over the years too, across that time frame. So I'm really excited to share some of that today. Just to talk a bit about product security. I think there's, like anything in security, there's so many different things that people call different things and where they fit in the organization, and product security isn't product security for another company. So I just want to talk a little bit about what we do in product security, just to kind of level set the different programs I'll be talking about that we've been growing out. So our product security engineering org consists of a lot of what folks would think of an application security team. So looking at, like what do we do to secure the applications and the products that our engineers are creating. But it also covers a lot of different areas as well, as far as, our incident response team, running our bug bounty program, all those things, kind of all those different service offerings we have across our software development and security development lifecycle, that falls under product security engineering. So I think the easiest way for me to think about it's like, when you think about the SDL, security development lifecycle, all those services are things that are owned by my teams.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. I've a bit of a similar background, so hopefully we can find some fun shared topics to run through today. Awesome. I was a developer that got into application and product security a bit naively. It was a little bit of a, how hard could this be? By the way, I'll do it myself. And here we are 20 years later, still trying to figure it out. It's been a pretty fun journey. Let's get into the topic at hand today. We're here to talk about dev teams and ops teams and security teams working together. DevSecOps as a term has been more prominent now, but just like product security, it's still one of those things that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I think there's still quite a bit of confusion around it. Some biases on whether or not you use it at all. I'll admit I go back and forth on like, do we need a new term for it? And if we're going to put security in the middle, do we also need to have DevSec QA compliance testing ops and include every element of quality engineering in there? But I'd love to hear your take on it. What does DevSecOps mean to you? What's the heart of it?
Yeah, I think, for me, again, I can kind of share my thoughts and how I've distilled down this terminology. Like you said, I think everyone might have their own viewpoint on it. But when I kind of break it down, right, I think first it's important to think about the change that I think folks saw with DevOps, right? And my impression of that, again, I was not in dev or operations at the time when DevOps came about, right? But from what I've seen, really the focus there is getting the capabilities, the tools, the processes, right, for developers to manage their own infrastructure, their own, operations, their own deployments, right? All those things that sometimes you would see, in a traditional organization, moved behind an infrastructure team. They're responsible for, configuring the infrastructure, getting those apps deployed. Whereas now that shift is really moving that infrastructure configuration as code, right, into the developer workflow. So it's like, to level set, like if we just take, the first term DevOps, that's my understanding of it, right? Is, the traditional, like, as to throw away around another term, right, that I think is equally, I don't want to say overplayed, but shift left, right? Like shift that work earlier on. Don't just save your infrastructure concerns, right, for when you're ready to release and deploy a product. Build that into the development process. I think similarly, I start thinking about, okay, well, how does security fit into that same sort of shift, right? And it is this kind of, let's get security into the workflows. Let's empower engineers, right, to do security things, instead of saying like, oh, you want to do security? That's over in the security department. Like, go fill out this form or go through this process. And really, the siloing, I think that's existed previously of, we have a security team focused on security, we have developers focused on developers, and they all do their own thing, right? It's really combining those. And in that, really setting up the expectations that engineers, right, are going to be responsible for some part of that, of securing their applications, which I think in hindsight, right, and you look at it and you're like, that absolutely makes sense. But then the hard part, right, is like,
when you say it out loud, you're like, of course.
But I think the hard part, right, is how do you do that, right? How do you balance, right, what engineers are experts at, what they are, professionals at in developing software, creating awesome and amazing products. How do you start shifting that over and be like, oh, also, right, like it's not only good enough, right, to write these amazing product engineering services and products, but you also need to start thinking about security. You're also going to take on security. I think that's where the meat of it is, right? How do you make that progress? How do you get security within that workflow without also impacting, right, what they're doing to create these products? And I think that's really the core of where I see DevSecOps coming, right? Is it's not only saying engineers are going to do security things in their development process, but it's empowering them, right? It's finding that right balance of, we still, at GitHub, we still have a product security engineering team full of subject matter experts, but what is the right things for us to be doing and focusing our subject matter expertise on, and what's the right things for engineers to do during their own processes?
Awesome. Hey, I want to talk to everybody in the audience here. We're glad you joined us today. We'd love for this to be a little bit conversational throughout the day. So if you have any questions for Greg or myself, or anything you'd like to follow up on, please use the Q&A tab on I'm not sure which side it is. One of the two sides. You'll find a Q&A button, and we'd love to hear from you. We'll hope to try to take as many of those questions as we can throughout the chat today. So Greg, you talked about figuring out the right things and the right balance for them to work at. I'd love to hear a few examples of that. Like, what are the ones that have just worked really well for you?
Yeah, I think there's, It's when you look at what you want to roll out, right? It's a matter of, I think it's always going to be on the security team or my team's responsibility, right, to make sure it's successful, right? And to do that, right, you can't just look and say, okay, let's take for an example static analysis, right? Like this is pretty straightforward, right? It's pretty clear, at least from my opinion, right? Like how this needs to shift towards more of this DevSecOps model, and that is, right, we're no longer running scans, doing code, and doing our code scans and generating a report in our tool that's squirreled away in some system that only security has access to, and then doing the triage ourselves and then saying, okay, this is an actual valid vulnerability. Now let's work on getting that fixed. I think the shift here and how you make that work is not just saying like, okay, developers, you now have access to this tool. You're now responsible for these reports. Go do it, right? Go do it. A complete context shift from what you were working on before, and now hop over here and you're going to be doing this little extra security stuff on the side. What you really need to get to is a point where that is just part of the development process. And that's something we did early on at GitHub, even as a team of 3 engineers on our application security team, was looking at how do we get, we know we want to do stack analysis. We know we want to do that in a way that's the best experience for engineers. How do we get that in front of them in the kind of the most natural way for what they're doing? And in doing that, we wrote a lot of tools that integrate, I guess at GitHub, we write everything on GitHub. So I feel like there's a unique advantage there of, we know where our developers are at. We know the processes they go through, right? Which all centralized on GitHub. And as part of that, engineers are used to this. We're doing a code review. We have a PR. I put it out there for code review for my team, right? Everyone's taking a look at this code to see what they think, does it meet, our expectations and our requirements, and could there be improvements? And that's the ideal time to really get security, get those static analysis results, right? Even if it's not a human doing that review, just like we would with CI or tests or anything else, right? That's the right time to get that static analysis running, to get the conversation started with engineers. And that's really how I've viewed our static analysis, right? It's less of, this is 100% for sure a true positive, and you need to fix this, you need to address this, with 100% confidence. I don't think, I think our tools, what GitHub's doing with CodeQL and our code analysis projects, right? We're in a great path to creating a great experience with good results, but there's always going to be that, those false positives. So I've looked at static analysis as more of an education and awareness sort of tool, right? It's like, this could be cross-site scripting, right? Like, or this could be an issue, this could be a SQL injection, but it's a start of conversation, right? And that's a way for engineers to say, oh, I never even thought about that. Let me, maybe it's an engineer that doesn't have experience with security vulnerabilities. And they're like, oh, this is, what is SQL injection? Let me look into that. So it's my job to make sure they can explore that and understand, right, what the issue is at hand. And then if they have any questions, that subject matter expertise to really dig into it, right, still on my team. So we need to be available, not just to say, go review this, handle this yourself, but work with us, right? We would like you to get up to speed and to understand this and to be able to act on these scan results yourself. But we're still here as a resource. And it also allows us to stay involved, right? Not just kind of throw it over the wall and good luck with that. Like, let us know and we'll come back if you're out of SLAs for addressing it. It lets us know, right, being in that loop to say, hey, everyone's running into issues with this scan result, or, we're not explaining that well enough in what we're presenting to engineers, that everyone's coming back to my team saying like, hey, like, what is this? What is this? Right. And then it's like, that's a clear signal that we need to improve this experience. So really, looking at an area here of moving from, we kind of have that work and expertise siloed, to moving over to engineers, but not expecting them to be experts out of the gate, right? Allowing, still collaborating and bringing that subject matter expertise. And then over time, right, that's like a natural knowledge sharing, learning experience as we have those conversations.
Yeah, there's something you said in there that resonated really, really strongly about meeting the developers where they are, not asking them to come to different tools. Speed and velocity are such a core tenet and principle of DevOps that it just makes it like asking engineers to take responsibility for security, but then use the security team's tools. You can start to see how that immediately falls apart, right? Engineers aren't going to go log into HP Fortify and manually scan their code and then download their PDF and then parse it back out. Right? That's where these new like GitHubs, Dependabot, and CodeQL really meet engineers where they are. They don't disrupt DevOps flow, and it's a core part of empowering those teams to take responsibility for security. You can't just dump it on them. That resonates really, really strongly with me. Let's change gears a minute. Where does it go wrong? Where do people mess this up? What have you messed up? What have you seen others mess up? Where did DevSecOps gone wrong?
Yeah, no, and I think I think it's really I think in a security organization, you can sit down and really kind of dream up, right? Being like, this is everything we should do, right? There's always trying to strive for an absolute security, right? And to get there, right, it's like, okay, we need to do this, 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 and there's no exceptions, right? This is the path we need to drive forward. And this is the amount of, I guess, rigor we need to put into everything. And that's fine, that's great, but you have to understand. And I think it's the job of the security organization, right, to lead with that mindset of we're subject matter experts in security. Our focus, right, our priorities is reducing that security risk, shipping secure products, and that's great. But at the same time, you need to balance that with everything else going on in the organization. Kind of I mentioned earlier, right? We want to make sure our engineers can still ship products, right? Our goal is not to, secure GitHub by not shipping any new products, right? That'd be great. I mean, but you don't want to become that team, right? That everyone feels like, okay, we're the team of no, right? We are the team of that's a interesting, maybe a little bit terrifying, maybe a little bit exciting idea, and we want to help you get there. So I think one of the big areas where I've seen this go wrong, right, is because it's our mission to reduce risk and to secure applications to over focus on that. And you really need to understand the impact of anything you roll out, be it static analysis, be it a bug bounty program, whatever it might be. There's going to be an impact and a commitment from your engineering teams, right, to work on that. Unless, again, it's hard to, when it comes time to fix a vulnerability, right? And I think, especially at GitHub at our skills now, my team isn't sitting down and deploying to production. We did way back in the day, right, when we were a team of 3 engineers, but not anymore. You really need those partners. And to get those partners, you need to be honest, right, of what is really the risk of what we're asking them to do, what's the impact, what improvements are we going to make, and at what cost does that come from, like you mentioned, right, product velocity. And that's really where it ties, it gets you thinking about not just what's the biggest impact we can have to reduce risk, but what's the biggest impact we can have to reduce risk that also is the lowest impact, right, is the most natural thing. And you might have to adjust. You might have to change priorities, right, given the maturity of where the organization is. So I think that's one big kind of risk, right, in shifting to this viewpoint is there is a menu of things, right? There is any number of, I guess, maturity and service offerings a product security engineering team could do, but it's all about prioritizing the right ones for the right, where your company is at, for the right growth of your company, and really kind of understanding, right, maybe an organization isn't at the point where they can take on, a more rigorous part of the SDL, and maybe that's fine, right? Maybe you just focus on things that you are going to be successful and are going to build up those relationships and build up kind of that muscle of an engineering org to say okay, cool, security is also us, right? We are working together with security. And then as you roll out more and more, I guess, time commitments and things that are going to be a bigger impact in engineering, you already have that foundation where, again, security trusts engineering and engineering trusts security, right, to do the right thing, and everyone really understands each other's mission and priorities.
Yeah, you make it sounds so simple. The way to keep it not going wrong is to focus on relationships and building trust. Yeah. I was hoping you could go a little bit deeper on that and kind of help us empathize a bit and help us put ourselves in the shoes of just the dev side of the function here. What are some of the trade-offs that they're dealing with, and how have you helped them navigate those?
Yeah, and I think again, like just leaning into that idea of relationships and empathy. I just want to, I feel like, and maybe touching a little bit on our previous question, right? Where have you seen it go wrong, right? And talking about a bit how you avoid that, right? And building those relationships. A lot of times, right, I've seen what's happened in security organizations and how they kind of tear down those relationships really is coming in as like, we're subject matter experts, right? Like we tore apart your code and found these vulnerabilities. And there's someone on my red team, Stefan Edwards, who I like to quote on this, that says, it's like, we're not here to come in and like dunk on engineers and be like, show off and say, look at these amazing things we found and go fix it. And you did it wrong, right? You really need to understand, at least from my perspective, from the companies I worked with, engineers want to do the right thing. They want to write the best products, the most secure code, the most reliable and performant code that they can. But you have to understand they're juggling, like where do we want to go with the product? Where do we need to go with the product, right? And how do we get there? And what's the right prioritization? So I think really a big thing in building that empathy is really understanding where in like the engineering mindset of like, and just assume that there isn't, a desire just to ignore security, right, in lieu of shipping product features, but really provide them the best way, right, to do what they want to do, to create secure applications and to really, again, tying back to that, building the best service offerings that we as a security organization can do to give them confidence in the security and assurance in the products they're shipping. So really, I think for me, empathy is, not just understanding the development processes, right? Like where they're at, how they're developing code, where they're doing code reviews, how engineers are onboarding and learning about how to do engineering at the company. And let's teach them how to do security at the company as well at the same time, right? You don't need to go through a separate security onboarding, right? You need to just go through your engineering onboarding and you learn about security throughout that process. And so it's about all of those things, but it's also understanding, I don't want to say politics, because it's not really politics, right? I think a lot of people say it's like, oh, like, anytime it gets to a certain level in the org chart, right, then it becomes politics. Like, no, it's the reality of we have certain resources, we have certain goals as a company, and how do we meet those, right? And you want to make sure security is a goal and represented, right? But you can't ignore the fact that shipping products and new features is also an equally or, maybe even more important goal, right? If we're not shipping products, we're not shipping features, we're not improving the product for our customers.
There's a great question here from Brian B. That's I'll kind of paraphrase as if you have a dev team that is starting from ground zero with no security experience, where do you start on educating and getting them involved?
Yeah, and it really kind of depends, I think, on the scale of the organization, right? I can share a bit about when I first joined GitHub, way back 9 years ago. It was a much smaller company. I want to say there was about maybe 250 employees at the time. And we had made an investment early on, which I think is maybe unique in application security. Like I said, I was basically joined a team. I was the second person. It's probably the third or fourth person in the security organization, but I was also like the second person on the application security team. So it's like, I think really rare to get to the point, right, where you have a early on focus on application security. But really what allowed us to share our security knowledge, get that knowledge up to speed, was actually just working with engineers directly on the work they were doing, right? We were a core part of that code review process early on for a lot of the development that happened at GitHub, right? There was, someone was launching a new feature. We were there to do that code review. And in that code review, not just take it as a, here's an opaque recommendation, right? Without any knowledge behind it, but really sharing the why behind it, right? Why are we suggesting this, what are the risks, and collaborating, not just saying this is how you should fix it, but collaborating, ensuring, I think, not being too opinionated a lot of times on those fixes, because you have to trust your engineers that they're going to be the experts on that code and how to fix things. You can make recommendations and make sure that that actually addresses the risk and holistically addresses the risk that you're looking at. But it's really that collaboration. I feel like early on at that scale, we were able to work with a broad range of engineers directly in that development process. That was really key for us getting, I think, both security education and awareness of those topics, but also building that security culture, right? Kind of sharing that, security is an important thing here. It's not something that comes as an afterthought. It's part of our development process.
Yeah, so education starts from getting involved, become part of the process yourself. Don't just throw training material over to dev teams.
And it's not to say, right, like at a certain scale, there very much is a purpose in, like you can't scale like something like education and training, video or course would, right? That's just something that can run in the background. And we do that at GitHub too, as we scaled, right? But I think the important thing there that we found is finding content that's going to resonate with engineers. And this has always been one of my core principles in leading the team, is in all of this, the ability we have to utilize engineers' time, right? Like we actually have an engineer focused on something we've said, that's our number one resource, right? If we squander that, or if teams don't want to spend time working on security things because we wasted their time in the past, right? Like that's a huge issue. That's where you start building that culture of, we did this and there was no purpose and it was just a roadblock, right? And I've really kind of thought about this as we roll out more, I want to say generic, right? But less hands-on engineering training, is making sure it's laser focused on the things that our engineers care about, right? You could roll out a CBT on web application security, right? And it's a great overview, but a lot of times, right, that steers towards, you see trainings, right? It's like, we're not going to do a training on Java when we're not a Java shop, right? And I used to do consulting and I used to do training sometimes. I just remember cases of going into customers, right? And we would give this web application security training and all this thing. And they're like, we write like some 4GL language. Like, we don't even know like this is great information. Like, it was entertaining, I hope, right? It was entertaining. It was good knowledge. But when they go back to their job, they're not really able to apply that. So I think that's really important to make sure the training you're rolling out, and if you're doing this in a very, either asynchronous or, in a course that you've developed, try to make that as best as possible. It's going to be hard, especially at a company at a large scale, to hit all the topics and make sure everything's applicable, but maybe zoom out on some of those topics, right? Make it less about, SQL injection and more about, just the core of, of output encoding, right? Or using proper encoding. And then those topics start becoming a lot more applicable generically, even if you can't, make it specifically for every, tech stack and language that your engineers are using.
I could weigh in a little bit on my point of view on this one. And then Brian had a follow-up question about any vendors or trainings we would recommend. I just really wanted to amplify the points Greg made around context and make it specific. It can't just be this one-time set it and forget it thing. Developers are continuously developing, especially in a DevOps model, and continuous learning needs to be part of that. And you'll have far more effectiveness with a contextualized security learning than a one-time training that covers the basics. You would inevitably want both, but Brian, to think about how to incorporate it on a continuous basis, ideally contextualized to your organization. One of the things that many teams struggle with here, which I found to be incredibly effective in education, is talk about real world vulnerabilities from your application around what vulnerabilities, pick a vulnerability we had, just starting simple, in the last 3 months. Talk about who introduced it, how it got introduced, how it got missed, what we're doing about it going forward. And it's you'll get incredible dev engagement on that if they know it's specific to them and they see the consequences of what happened. And it starts to normalize the idea that devs are responsible for vulnerability and security in a really powerful way. Whereas like if you're just preaching generic security training at them, it still is based in the assumption that the security team is responsible for security. On the vendor recommendation, I'll give a plug to a company called Hack EDU. They're one of the smaller, more upstart ones, but I think they do a really good job of this contextualized security learning. We partner with them at HackerOne to take findings from our customers' programs and incorporate them into training. So they'll tailor your training based on what you're getting out of your vulnerability management program or your bug bounty program or your other findings, which we've seen just resonate more with developers. And the interface is really built for developers rather than security teams. And I'd encourage any vendor you're looking at to look at it through that lens. Like, don't let your biases as a security leader determine what education you'll make sure that it's built for developers with developers in mind. And that the best suggestion I can have on this front is partner with some engineering leaders and some developers to do the actual vendor selection on what the training should look like and how to make it relevant to the team.
Yeah, I'll definitely echo that recommendation of looking at real world vulnerabilities, right? I think that has the biggest impact, right? It becomes it's more work from the security team, right? To just distill that down and really tease out, right? What did we learn from this, right? How can we use it? But it really does help to see, like you said, contextualize that in like, what was you can say like SQL injection, this is typically what we see in the risk there, but sharing that, right, as how did this actually, manifest itself? How did this, and like you said, I would also say, right, it's not only the important thing to share, right, is it's not only, right, there was a vulnerability that this development team, added in this area of the product. It's also, I think, going back to what you said, saying, what are we doing about it, right? And I one of the approaches that I think is really important, one of the responsibilities a product security engineering team needs to take on is sure, someone wrote a line of code that introduced a vulnerability, but it's really the responsibility. I feel very strongly that for any vulnerability we have, right, it is my team's and my responsibility to have prevented that, right? We're developing a program with multiple steps along the way, from code analysis, architecture and design, assessment, bug bounty, all of these things, right? And our goal is to catch those vulnerabilities early on. So I want to just say, with a vulnerability, it's really important for me to say, okay, we caught this vulnerability at this phase of the development lifecycle. Maybe it was out the door, maybe it was during our assessment, but for any of those vulnerabilities, ideally, right, and again, there's never absolutes, right? Like, it's always a growing and maturing, but ideally, right, we would have caught that earlier. We would have caught that in architecture and design. We would have caught that in code analysis, and using that to really feed back into kind of what I was saying, what's the right prioritization? What areas are the right time to mature, right? And because, yeah, ideally, we would catch everything before developers even sat down and wrote a code. We would have paved paths and frameworks and libraries, right? And developers, we could shift this whole paradigm and say developers don't need to think about security because what they're developing on top of will prevent them from ever writing a security vulnerability. Now, again, that's an absolute. Maybe someday in my career I'll see that, right? But that's the ideal. But there's always like a gradient of, well, cool, like for some sort of things we could catch early on, or write a paved path for, made a library so engineers didn't have to write their own output encoding routine or cryptography library, right? Like, let's provide them with those that we see kind of being those hotspots of engineers coming to us and saying, hey, I have to do crypto. Hey, I have to do crypto. And like, if we're always offering, recommendations and they have to go off and engineer, it's like, well, let's take that into our own hands, create the best library for them to do this that will meet their needs and get that out early on. But you can't do that for everything. So it's just like always this path, but it's always important to take that look back and say, hey, where could have we done better, right? And I think anytime an engineer, introduces a vulnerability, there's a vulnerability in the code, it's important to understand the context that was introduced. Did it go through static analysis? Did we not find it, right? Did we have a conversation? Like, there's so many things along the way that probably could have happened to prevent that vulnerability. And a lot of times, right, it's responsibility of my team, of a product security engineering team, to make sure that does happen, right? Even in the case where it's an engineer's like, yeah, engineer had a static code analysis warning and they dismissed it, right, and moved on, right? And it's like, well, we're doing, you know, a lot of folks would say, well, we're doing everything we can, right? We told them, it's like, no, like, why did they dismiss it, right? Was it because they have so much pressure to get out the door? Did they not understand it, right? Did they, like, whatever it might be, were they burnt by static analysis in the past and wasted a lot of time on false positive? There's a reason why that got dismissed and they didn't reach out to the team and say, you know, hey, I need to dig into this, or be able to figure it out, you know, figure out that vulnerability and figure out itself. So it's important to me to always be taking responsibility for those things. And again, responsibility, I think, is different than taking the blame for it, right? It is like, that's the job. That's why I have a team, right? To do this is to prevent vulnerabilities in the end, to write these secure products.
It's such an enlightened approach. I really admire it. Okay. I wanted to circle back to the collaboration topic we were on and finish that through. You started giving us a lot of good insight into collaboration with dev teams. What are the other important points of collaboration for product security? Who are the other key parties you're focused on collaborating with?
Yeah, I think, you know, obviously engineers, we've talked a ton, right? I think in you know, when you look at DevSecOps, right, you think dev, right? You're collaborating with those developers, all the things we've talked about of really coming up with that best list of service offerings for your engineers for where they're at, right? And in that, right, it's really understanding, we talked, right? Like it's really understanding of what's the maturity of your engineering organization, what can you offer, right? It might not be the most glamorous and, you know, most interesting service to offer, but it might be what your engineers need the most. I think when we think about some of the other, you know, as part of the SDL, as part of the work that my team does, there's so much other collaboration across the organization too. And that's, you know, we call ourselves product security engineering, right? We are in line with that engineering work, but just like engineers, right, we have collaboration that needs to be done with product. We need to understand, right, from the product organization of what ideas are out there, what areas are we growing into, so we can make sure we're prepared, right, to have those conversations of saying, cool, like to implement that product, right, we're going to really need to focus on this area of the design or this area of architecture, right? Like I look at things like code spaces and actions and the different practice areas, you know, product areas that GitHub has gotten into. And right, you have a product team coming and saying, hey, we're going to start, you know, running CI, running, you know, we're not just going to be hosting people's code, we're going to be running people's code. And in your head as a security person, you're like, whoa, like that's like, we're going to get tricky, right? But it's important to know that, right? So you can say like, okay, cool. Like we know that we need to prioritize working on the architecture of this, working on the design of this, because this isn't one of those product areas where it can just go through the development lifecycle and we take a look at the end and say like, okay, did they think of everything they need to, right, to secure an architecture like this? So it's really important, I think, internally to collaborate and to understand the directions that product is going. And in that also looking at like, cool, well, product is moving in this direction. It's like, you know, a new product area. It's a new thing we're doing, but here's some overlap in some of the architecture we've done in the past and some of the recommendations there, and really start, you know, you can, I think, get efficiency, right, as you see more and more things come through and say like, okay, cool, well, actions kind of looks like code spaces because it's arbitrary compute with this different thing. So let's just take all of our learnings we got from that other product work and apply it here. So I think there is a lot of collaboration on the product side of things. And one thing, as my team's grown, and, you know, in the past year, my teams, you know, we've really kind of brought what used to be application security, incident response, our product security team that's been focused on a lot of security product engineering works and doing that paved path core libraries. We brought that all underneath product security engineering. So as part of that, I've started to get a much, you know, more in-depth insight of incident response. And it's brought, you know, for me, this is areas of the company I haven't collaborated with before, which has been, you know, making me realize, oh, how just important and how important it is to build out these relationships and have collaboration, right? As part of incident response, we're working with, you know, our customer support teams, we're working with our comms team, we're working with our legals team. There's so many different parties involved when you're going through an incident response process or, you know, or anything like that. So it's just been amazing. Like we say DevSecOps, right? But there's so much more involved. You really, the right areas within product security engineering, you really are interacting with everyone across the company. And you want to build those relationships, because when it is incident response time, right, you want to have those relationships and make sure everyone's prepared for, you know, the work you're doing, everyone's in the loop. So it's been a really great opportunity internally, right, to share and collaborate.
Very cool. Yeah, it goes back to the opening here of like, if we just limit it to DevSecOps, you're really missing out on a really some core components of getting quality, trustworthy software out there.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about external collaboration for a bit.
Yeah.
You're one of the more public and open teams out there. I'd love to hear a little bit how you think about interacting with the community, with hackers, with researchers, with colleagues in other orgs. What does external collaboration look like?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, that's a huge, I mean, again, the role, right, that this external collaboration plays, you know, in our security development lifecycle, right, shouldn't be glossed over, right? We're doing all of these things internally, right? We're doing our own internal assessment, all that, but we know we can only scale that as much, right? Right? We can get the right folks in, we can grow, but at the same time, we're utilizing, right, HackerOne, the hackers on the platform to really look at, you know, that's great, that's cool that we're doing all this stuff internally, you know, the subject matter expertise, but at the same time, right, there is, you know, a large number of folks that are really interested in looking at the security at GitHub as well and getting paid for that and working with them. And I think it's really important to look at a bug bounty program and the hackers there, right, not just as like, I feel like there's always like a push, right? Like, and if you go back to what we were saying, right? It's like there's any number of things that we want to roll out, and like bug bounty is probably on a checklist someplace, right? But if you approach that as just, okay, we spun up a bug bounty program, like next thing off the SDL checklist, it's not going to work out well. I don't think it's going to be a good experience for anyone involved. But B, you're really not going to get out of that what you could. So how I've approached our bug bounty program really is, you know, it's not even the end of the SDL, right? It is like somewhere in the middle in that development life cycle, we're engaging hackers, you know, be it, maybe it's a feature we rolled out publicly. Great. That's automatically rolled into our public scope. We hope to get feedback on that, right? And hopefully, and you know, a lot of times we get quick feedback. You know, we launch a new product, hackers are interested in that. We're getting really good feedback in that, right? And from my point of view, it's, you know, and I think maybe this is what trips up some companies in rolling out a bug bounty program. Like, you start a bug bounty program, you're going to get vulnerabilities. That's the whole point of this, right? Yeah. It's not so you have like a way for people to, I don't know what some folks expect out of it, right? Like the point is you get vulnerabilities. So for me, it's like, if we roll out some, we get vulnerabilities, right? And, you know, sure, maybe it's a little late in the game, right? Maybe we wish we could have caught those early on in our internal assessment.
Definitely,
but at the end of the day, it's like, that's the whole point. That's why we have this as a process at this point in the development life cycle, and really kind of treating the researchers as part of that team. I think that's the important part too. It's not, you know, an adversarial relationship or a hacker trying just to get money out of the program, right? It is like, no, this is a core part of our development life cycle, and we need to support it, right? We need to have the resources to support and grow that part of the development life cycle, just like any other part we would. And, you know, just in the past 6 months, we've built out our bug bounty team. We now have 3 individuals working solely on how do we triage, how do we make the best experience, how do we grow those relationships with those hackers. So just like your assessment team, right, you're going to want to have the opportunities to meet these hackers, to engage them more closely, and just like everything else in the SDL, shift a little bit left, right? Like, and that's something we've done too, right? We've realized there's really no reason to wait until we publicly launch, right, a new feature to engage the hacker community, right? So we've started rolling out, we have a VIP program, which is, you know, pretty much an early access to GitHub features for hackers that we've worked with in the past. We have them invited to a private Slack. We can do more real-time engagement, real-time support, and things like that. So it's worked out really well to say, you know, maybe if it's something that's not even a private beta yet, maybe it's something that we're comfortable sharing externally, maybe it's a private alpha, right? And saying like, we're going to get this feature added to you on github.com. And here's some bonuses, right? It's like the great thing too is you can make it exciting too, right? As a security team for new products and features we're rolling out, we're already doing a lot of this work to say like, what's the threat? Where are our risks? What's our threat model, right? Like, what are the things we care about? What are we concerned about? Like, share that with your hackers so they know where to look. It's no reason not to share that. And we've had really good success in doing that and getting a review of a lot of our product features even before they present the risk that they would if it was a public feature. So again, like looking, as part of any part of that SDL, looking at how do we do this earlier? How do we capture those vulnerabilities and mitigate those vulnerabilities early on?
Warms my heart so much to hear you talk about it that way, Greg. Like really viewing hackers as part of the process there is fantastic. We had a question here from Shiva on the Q&A side, which was bounty specific. It's about metrics in the bounty program. Mm-hmm. You talked a little bit about qualitatively what constitutes a successful program. How are you measuring that? What are the metrics you care about?
I think the biggest, right, it goes, and there's two things, or I don't want to say two things, probably more than two things, but there's a few things, right, I think that come out of that. And one is going back, right? The purpose we're running a bug bounty program is to get vulnerabilities, right? And I think that's, again, one of the metrics we look at, right, is how many vulnerabilities did we get in, right, that actually resulted in, we get a lot of reports, and some of those, right, are vulnerabilities, some of those aren't, right? Some of those are things that, we know are known risks, right? We have a different set of categories, but really, how many new and novel vulnerabilities are we getting in through the bug bounty program that's resulted in us, fixing that and mitigating it? And I think that's it's a big indicator to me, right? Like, is this still bringing the value, right? Like, we know over time, we've gotten a lot of really good vulnerabilities in. We've gotten a lot of, great, improvements to our platform through conversations and reports in through the bug bounty program. So are we still doing that? And if that drops off, right, to me, that's an indicator of something's happened with our relationship with researchers where they're not submitting to our program, or our program's gotten to the point, right, where it's just not interesting anymore, right? Maybe we need, maybe our scope is too small. Maybe we're not providing, right, the right resources to point our hackers at the right spots, right? And that's where the VIP program, like, how do we re-engage researchers and say, GitHub.com and our, GitHub's bug bounty scope is very large, right? And it's been around for a long time. So how do we really focus that program in interesting areas? So if we see kind of that number drop off and say, okay, we're not getting great engagement, like, is there more scope we can add in? Do we need to redirect focus, right? How do we get that going, right? And I think that's one of the core metrics just from my perspective. So again, like, first bug bounty program is to get these vulnerabilities in and get them fixed. And are we still meeting those goals? I think another important one metric I've been looking at more as we've really started resourcing, that experience for our bug bounty researchers, right? Like, what is that experience, right? What is our time to respond? Something we've always looked at, right, and always tried to maintain really high standards for is, if folks are submitting vulnerabilities to us and it's sitting, right, and we're not collaborating, we're not getting an answer out there, right, and realistically, and we're not getting potential vulnerabilities to our development teams as quickly as possible, that's a big indicator to me, right, that we're understaffed internally. Maybe we don't have, the resources we need to do that triage, to do that investigation, to run through, okay, what is this report? Let me distill this down for my development team and getting that out to development teams. So that's another really important metric for me, just from a, program health, team health, like, and in the end, I think, what does that experience look like for our hackers? Are we responsive? Are we, making sure that we can handle the amount of reports we're getting in? And even at that scale, are we still doing a good job? Is it still a good experience for everyone involved?
Cool. It's hard to have any conversation without coming back to something related to speed and velocity. Such a core ops principle. You got to keep it in mind for everything you're doing in your security program, and bug bounty is no exception. Definitely +1 to having some speed, responsiveness related metrics in any bounty program you roll out. We've got about 10 minutes left. Probably time for one or two more topics. If anyone has anything they'd love to hear Greg speak to, put it into chat or Q&A. But I thought I'd kick us off with one more. It feels like an hour ago at this point, but you briefly touched on as you're scaling your program, and it occurred to me that you've really scaled this program from nothing. I'd love to hear you talk about what you've seen scaling product security through stages of growth.
Yeah, and it's like you said, it's been a long while now. Thinking about where we started, as a team of 3 application security engineers, looking at like, okay, this is everything that's going on. What's the most impactful thing that I can bring my knowledge to? And really, that was like the start of what we're doing, right? What's the best and most appropriate place to bring our subject matter expertise for where the company was at that time, right? As I mentioned, there's a lot of, being involved in those code reviews, and over time, right, looking at like, okay, cool, we need to do stack analysis. We think that's going to be, a force multiplier for what we're doing and getting that knowledge out there. Okay, and we need to start a bug bounty program, right? That's going to allow us to get these in. So over time, right, as that team grew, as the application security team, we took on more and more work of just, okay, the application security team is really your one-stop shop for everything we do. But really what happened over time was 2 things. One, we just couldn't scale fast enough with the pace that development was growing. But also, we were really stretched across a lot of different types of work, right? Like sitting down and writing a secure library, or triaging the bug bounty program, or doing assessment work. They're all while towards the same goal, they're all very different shapes of work in different contexts, right? So what we ran into is a lot of our team was just doing a lot of context switching, right? Between assessment, oh, now we got this incident in, so now it's all hands on deck on that, right? We have this, this thing come in, oh, but then we need to sit down and do this development. So early on, what we did is we broke out kind of that, how we were doing development work to support our platform and the security of our platform and our engineers, into a separate team who could kind of scale and focus and prioritize their work as a typical engineering and development team would. Whereas, our assessment work and our bug bounty work and all of that work kind of ran in that more reactive sort of mode. And now as we've grown even more, it's like, okay, it's not just one thing to say we have development work and we have, assessment, reactive work. It's like, well, if you have a team that has a schedule of assessments that they're working on, security testing that they need to do, we really should limit the impact, right, of this very reactive or triage work of a bug bounty, that you typically see, that we see on our product security incident response team. So it's even more like teasing apart, right? And I think that's where over time we've just gotten, the teams and their focus areas have just gotten, and really in the past year or two, just more and more focused on, this is the part of the SDL I'm going to own and grow, where we had, developer awareness and training, something we did collaboratively across the application security team. Now we have a team really focused on what's the best thing we can do here, what's the best content we can create, and where do we need to go next? We know what we're doing right now is, it's always a constant evolution and maturity and growth. So it's really focusing, at the scale of my team, which now, again, went from 9 years ago, I think I'm about up to 30 folks right now in product security engineering. You can't just have a pool of 30 individuals who are saying like, we're kind of doing everything related to security. It's really nailing down that focus and making it a clear process, right? It's like, as you do that, it becomes more confusing to engineers, right? It's like, oh, do I need to go talk to the architecture team or the assessment team, and who's doing that? And I think one thing in that scaling is just being very clear, both internally of who's working on what, not putting up silos and said, we're just focused on assessment work. Like, don't come talk to us if we have an incident we're running, right, in our response process, but really coming up with the right mechanisms to collaborate both internally in our teams and making it very clear for the rest of the organization of who's doing what services we're offering. So that's been a lot of the scaling I've been focused on, right, is like, we've always been, I guess, a team focused on like, these are the resources we have, what's the best thing we can do with those resources. and really kind of taking that apart and saying like, okay, these are the things we need to offer, and what's the best way to grow each of those in parallel. And that's been really, really kind of a core part of what I've been focused on in scaling out the team.
Oh, it's a long journey. I know you feel like you probably come so far. It's so
Yeah,
far.
it's a long journey, but then I look at it and it's funny. I came from consulting, right? And I was like, oh, like coming in house, like working on a product security team. Am I just going to get bored just like staring at the same website day in, day out, like doing security? And it's like, it's amazing to see, right? Of like parts of what I looked at 9 years ago, you know, they're all still there, right? But like, it's just grown and gotten into so many different spaces and technologies and just changes. It's just always really a new, interesting thing to focus on. So it's like my original concerns of like, is this just going to be boring? Like looking at a web app, it's like, oh, no, it's grown enough to bring its own challenges for sure.
We've got time for one last question here from Brian that I thought would be a good wrap up on closing thoughts for us. He's asking for any tips we have on converting the naysayers, those, and he phrased it as those who don't think security is important. I think it's a good to kind of summarize the key takeaways that we had for today. And Brian, I think I'll echo something that Greg talked about early on. It's really about empathizing with what there are. Like if you've got the assumption that the dev team or others involved in the process don't think security is important, I'd really just try to operate there. Like devs want to do the right things. In the business shipping products, they don't want to ship insecure products, but they also don't want it's slowed to a halt where they can't get their job done or they can't release. So you really have to empathize and understand with what their goals are and how to apply security in a way that is either balanced or, in an ideal case, not disruptive to it. And that's it's an important mindset. But it goes into understanding that the role of a security team is to be the subject matter experts, but ultimately you need to be aligned on the goal is to build software and build product, not just to get it to a perfect secure place. I think another takeaway to have on that front around how to do that is recognize that it's a maturity curve. Greg talked a lot about this. It's like understanding what's the right maturity of your engineering organization today and what are the right processes to get started with. Don't try to overwhelm them with what a ideal state may look like. Everyone can find some baby steps that you can agree upon that add security, don't inhibit velocity, and that the dev team can feel like is a win for them along with you. And I think if you can find those win-win scenarios in your organization, it becomes a lot easier to get the naysayers on board. Greg, any closing thoughts, key takeaways you would add to Brian's question of how do you get folks on board with the concept?
No, I think you covered a lot of them. I would say, you know, and it can be overwhelming too, a lot to say, like what to figure out really what is the right thing right now for your engineering team. And I guess just like my big takeaway there is like, go ask, right? Like don't try to come up with these answers in isolation, right? Either ride along with those engineering teams and see what they're running into and see their processes, or just have the conversation, right? And find some time to take away with an engineer or an engineering leader and just say, hey, like, this is what we have planned. This is what we're thinking. Like, what do you think, right? Because almost everything that I see us wanting to do in security is something that other areas, and this is important too, like other areas in engineering are also looking at the same questions when it comes to availability or reliability or whatever it might be, right? It's like maybe they've already thought about this, right? Maybe they've already thought about how they've moved testing and QA over to engineering. Is that really that much different? So it's really kind of digging in and saying like, what's your experience? Like, it doesn't need to be focused on security, but what's been your experience in making the shift? You know, if a team's already gone through that DevOps shift, right? Like what worked for them? Because we're not inventing anything new. We just are bringing a different area of focus and a different perspective to that. So really lean on engineers who have been doing this to know what have they done in the past for areas unrelated to security, and then think about how that applies and how that could be successful to what you're trying to accomplish in your security org.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. Everybody, I'm going to turn it over to Cody for a second to wrap us up. Before we do, 2 last shout outs here. Greg is hiring. He's got an awesome team. We'd love to have you on it. Go check out his applications. And if you're thinking about how to get more security feedback into your SDL when the time's right. I'm a big believer in external hackers and bounty programs being a key part of getting developers involved and responsible for security. We'd love to talk about it when you're ready for it. Cody, over to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Alex and Greg. What an awesome conversation to be a part of. A quick reminder that today's session was recorded. You'll receive a link to access the on-demand recording after the webinar concludes, or you can also find the recording on the DevOps website if you just visit devops.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section. Real quick, I want to announce the 4 winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing. Our first winner is Mo F. Our second winner is Betty W. Our third winner is Manuel R. And our fourth winner is Des V. So congratulations to the 4 of you. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim the gift card. And if you don't see an email, check your spam folder. So again, Alex and Greg, thanks so much for being here with us today. What an awesome, in-depth conversation. I know I was able to take away quite a bit from it. I'm sure our audience was able to take away a little bit more. I'd also like to thank HackerOne for sponsoring today's webinar. And my final thanks goes to you, our audience, for being here with us for the entirety of today's program. This is Cody J. Brown signing off. Have a great day, and please fill out our post-webinar survey.